The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Mr. Schneider for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses. Without objection, witnesses, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days in which to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. This month's parliamentary elections in Lebanon and Iraq will have lasting implications, not just for their citizens, but for the interests of the United States and our allies throughout the Middle East, especially Israel. In Lebanon, Hezbollah and its allies have gained a majority in parliament, increasing the Iranian influence and the control over Lebanon's government. Many of us have been warning about Hezbollah's growing influence in Lebanon for quite a while now, suggesting that tough decisions needed to be made about U.S. assistance, including to the Lebanese Armed Forces, or the LAF. As I noted in a hearing on Lebanon last year, I've long been concerned over reports of the LAF-Hezbollah cooperation and U.S. commitment to the LAF. U.S. law stipulates that no assistance may be made available to the LAF or Lebanon's internal security forces if they are controlled by a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization. Hezbollah certainly classifies. While coalitions are still being formed, and it is not yet certain which ministries Hezbollah or its allies will control, I hope that this administration, unlike previous administrations from both parties, takes a clear-eyed approach to the LAF, reassesses our security assistance to Lebanon. Proponents of cooperation with the LAF have long argued that the LAF is the best counterweight against Hezbollah and the best way to weaken the Hezbollah influence. Yet, after years of cooperation, there is zero evidence that this policy is working. In fact, we've only seen Hezbollah's influence grow, including over the LAF. There is no doubt that weakening Hezbollah should be U.S. policy. The question is whether we're implementing the correct policies to do so. I'm still having a hard time understanding why the administration decided to cancel U.S. democracy and governance assistance in the run-up to the elections, assistance that could help support Lebanon's moderate forces. When I asked State about this in October, I was told that the administration would continue to support these programs, yet in report after report afterward, we heard that Embassy Beirut decided to cancel them. It is impossible to know what the election results would have been had these programs been continued, but one thing is clear. Moderate forces have lost once again in Lebanon, and Hezbollah, and by extension Iran, has further consolidated control. In Iraq, in a slightly different but no less dangerous a scenario, the Sadr Alliance surprise win has upended the presumed political order there, forcing a lot of people, including both in the U.S. and in Iran, to scramble. Notorious for his anti-American views and leadership of a militia that killed hundreds of American troops in the mid-200s, Sadr is now portraying himself as a nationalist and a reformer committed to rooting out corruption and protecting Iraqi sovereignty. This is certainly going to put the U.S. in a difficult position, as our future relationship with Iraq is now, at best, in limbo. There are also a lot of questions about Sadr's relationship with Iran and his professed resistance to Iranian influence. It's unclear just how strongly he believes in stopping Iranian interference in Iraq, and even if he's capable or willing to do so. The Iranian Quds Force commander has been making the rounds over the past week, shoring up ties with pro-Iranian politicians in an attempt to forge a more favorable coalition for Tehran, prospects that would severely jeopardize all of the progress and effort that we have put into Iraq. As of now, it remains to be seen exactly what type of coalition we end up with. I do hope we're doing everything we can to limit or push back against the influence of Iran And at the same time, we should also be planning on what to do for all possible outcomes. What is clear, however, is that Iran is not going anywhere anytime soon in the region, and by all accounts, despite whatever complications Sadr may cause, will maintain a tremendous amount of influence. In both Iraq and Lebanon, Iran continues to gain both in power and influence to the detriment of their citizens, regional stability, and U.S. national security interests. With Secretary Pompeo laying out the administration's Iran strategy just yesterday, I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses their critiques as well as their recommendations for rolling back Iranian influence in Lebanon, in Iraq, and throughout the greater Middle East. I'm also looking forward to hearing their assessment on how we can get to this point, why the U.S. was unable to make more progress in both countries leading up to the elections, and how we can work with our allies to counter Iran and advance our mutual interests in the region. Thank you so much, and with that, I will yield to my friend, Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Deutsch for convening this meeting in advance. I'll thank the witnesses for sharing your perspectives and insights on this important issue. These elections in Iran and Iraq are obviously very important for a number of reasons. It has impact in the countries. It's going to have an impact in the region, and the outcomes of this election and the directions these countries take are going to have an impact on the United States' interests. The election on May 6th in Lebanon were its first election since 2009. It should have, perhaps could have been an important step forward, but I was very disappointed personally, and looking at it from the perspective of Congress, to see the gains made by political parties affiliated and allied with Hezbollah. I have long been concerned by Hezbollah's operations in Lebanon and its involvement in the country's government. I am even more concerned by Iran's growing influence in the region, as evidenced by these recent events. I would like to associate myself with the Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen's comments, and I think we need to make sure we are looking not just at the short-term implications of Hezbollah's success, but the long-term implications for Lebanon and the region. As I turn to Iraq, Muqtada Sadr's return to prominence, his rise in this election, should be a concern for all of us. The future remains unclear, but the growing influence of Iran appears almost certain. The common thread between both these elections appears to be Iran and Iran's influence in the region. I think it's critically important that the United States focus on this and develop a strategy, articulate and share that strategy not just with Congress but the world. I want to thank the subcommittee for holding today's hearing so we can hear from our witnesses on how best to push back against Iran's increasing malign influence. We have to find a way to support legitimate aspirations of the Lebanese people, the Iraqi people, to create better lives for themselves. But we have to do it without propping up organizations like Hezbollah or strengthening Iran's other proxies. Again, I want to thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member and our witnesses today for your time, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and I'll be very brief in my statement so that we can get to our witnesses. As former chairman of this committee and having been on the committee for more than 2 decades now, I would just note that whereas it's encouraging to see both Lebanon and Iraq hold elections, that it's concerning to see Iran's growing influence both in Iraq and in Lebanon. In Lebanon, Hezbollah and their allied factions hold an increasing number of seats there, a majority in parliament, and despite its political influence, Hezbollah, let's face it, remains a terrorist organization that directly threatens our ally, our principal ally in the region, Israel, and it really does threaten the entire stability throughout the region. The intelligence community, in fact, now believes that Iranian proxies are the primary threat to our personnel in Iraq. So after we've spent so much blood and treasure, we must not let Iran reap the benefits of those sacrifices that were made at such a high cost by so many of our troops there. And then the effort that was made to finally destroy, for the most part, ISIS. So let's make sure that Iran is not the entity that ultimately benefits from the blood and the hard work of so many Americans and our allies. And I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. And now, Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of my biggest worries is that in the Western world, we're kind of tired of defending democracy and freedom, and we think we're exhausted. We're not, but we think we are. We convince ourselves we are sometimes. And in fact, when I came out of Iraq in 2009, that's actually when I made the decision to run for Congress, because I had seen between 2008 and 2009 massive improvements because of the surge in Iraq. And I knew that Iraq could be successful, but we'd have to stick with it for a little bit. And I heard the president at the time, the new President Obama, say that he wanted to get out of Iraq. And I remember in 2011, in fact, he said, we're leaving behind a stable, democratic, free, all these great adjectives, Iraq. And we left. And pretty soon we had ISIS, we had a collapse of the government, and we're back. So my biggest concern right now, Madam Chair, is that as we look at the behavior of Iran in the region, I think we've done the right thing by pulling out of the Iran deal because of their bad behavior. But I think it's important that no matter what happens in Iraq, we be careful not to leave it behind, because I've got another 5 years in the military and people I know are going to be in there even longer. I don't want to go back again. It's better to stay than leave and come back. So with that, Madam Chair, I thank you for holding this. I thank the guests for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kinzinger. And now I'm pleased to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for calling this hearing. I also want to welcome back our panel of experts, all familiar faces to this committee. We appreciate your being here today, and we look forward to your insight. This has been a thought-provoking few weeks in the Middle East, to say the least. We've watched as elections were held in Lebanon and Iraq, clashes erupted between Israel and Iran on an unprecedented level. The U.S. Embassy moved to Jerusalem, Hamas's violence renewed near Gaza and its aftermath, and the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. All of this gives us on this committee much to consider, and all of this impacts the discussion we're going to be having here today. Both Lebanon and Iraq are strategic interests to the United States. Both have teetered on fully entering Iran's sphere of influence in recent years. And while the results of the elections invite concern over the success of anti-U.S. Shia groups, we commend both countries for holding what we at this time believe to have been fair and honest elections. Democracy as an institution must be led from within, and we congratulate Lebanon and Iraq for continuing the path toward democracy. Dr. Wittes, you co-led the National Democratic Institute's delegation to observe the Lebanese elections, and I look forward to your take on democracy in action as you saw it. As we wait to see how the elections will impact the formation of new governments in both countries, there are a lot of questions for us to think about, in addition to the lingering questions about these countries' stability and the trajectory they're taking. We're concerned about the possible impact of the outcome of these elections to the Lebanese and Iraqi relationships with the United States. In Lebanon, where the U.S. has dedicated significant assistance in its economic and security sectors, we watched as a very low voter turnout, estimated at less than 50%, voted for traditionally Hezbollah allied partners. And I reiterate my long-standing position that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization in its entirety, and efforts to normalize Hezbollah and similar groups under the guise of politics is both misguided and it is dangerous. Nevertheless, I believe we must remain committed to helping those legitimate government institutions and forces in Lebanon that can counter Hezbollah and ultimately Iran's malign influence. I'm deeply concerned about Iran's intentions to provoke a conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. The United States must work to prevent Iran from establishing a permanent military presence in Syria, from which we have now seen it directly and brazenly attack Israel, and from continuing to transfer weapons and capabilities to Hezbollah in Lebanon. In Iraq, the recent elections propped up the anti-U.S. cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, whose violent insurgencies against U.S. forces resulted in so many U.S. military deaths, and we are deeply concerned by the Iranian voices permeating from Baghdad and the calls for the U.S. to disengage from a region where we have expended so much blood and treasure. The conventional defeat of ISIS is a tremendous victory, but for a long-term success to take hold, Baghdad and the United States must remain vigilant. A strong democratic Iraq cannot be achieved under the influence of the tyrannical Iranian regime, and Iran's attempts to sway Iraq in its direction are concerning. Apart from foreign influence concerns, both Lebanon and Iraq have economic and security concerns that cannot be ignored. ISIS, in the effort to defeat the group, left Iraqi cities in rubble with over 2 million Iraqis displaced. Lebanon is struggling with the impacts of a mass surge of Syrian refugees. Economic growth is vital to stability in both countries, and I'm concerned about government services failing to provide for citizens who may then turn to groups like Hezbollah or ISIS to fill the gap. We've got to examine the domestic issues and concerns that led to the outcomes produced by these elections if we're going to fully understand how the ultimately formed governments will orient themselves. There is a great deal to unpack here, and I thank our panel of experts for their time and expertise in helping us do that, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. And now we turn to Ambassador Wagner for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for hosting this hearing. It's encouraging to see Iraq and Lebanon hold democratic elections. I am, however, deeply concerned to see Iran's influence increasing steadily, if slowly, in Iraq and Lebanon's governing bodies. Iran does not hesitate to sow discord in its democratic neighbors to undermine our regional initiatives. Democracy flourishing in the Middle East is good for American interests and long-term stability of the region. It is clear to me that any strategy to contain Iran must include a democratic, independent Iraq and Lebanon. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and the questions that will ensue. I thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wagner. Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Yes, thank you very much for holding the hearing today. And if we're concerned about Iran and Iraq and Lebanon, and we're concerned about the expansion of Iranian influence, again, let me remind us, as I have in this hearing room so often, Iran is not our enemy. The mullah regime in Iran is our enemy. And the reason why we see that we are losing ground, in Lebanon and in Iraq, is because we have let the mullahs off the hook. They don't have any internal worries, so they are on the offensive. When we could be helping the Kurds, there are more Kurds in Iran than there are in Iraq, but we should be helping the Kurds in both Iran and Iraq. There are Baluch. There are people in Iran who hate the mullah regime, and they're getting not the type of support that they need. And if we started that strategy, we would have the mullah regime probably defeated within a short period of time, but at least not engaging in these activities in Lebanon and Iraq that are threatening to our security and the stability of that region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rohrabacher. Seeing no other requests for time, now I'm delighted to welcome our panelists. First, we thank Dr. Michael Doran, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he specializes in Middle East security issues. Prior to this position, Dr. Doran was a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute, held positions at NYU, Princeton, and the University of Central Florida, finally a good university, and served as a Senior Director in the National Security Council. Thank you so much for being today, sir. We look forward to your testimony. And next, we're delighted to welcome back Danielle Pletka, Senior Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Prior to this, Ms. Pletka served as a staffer for the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Thank you for being here. We look forward to your testimony, and we see that your two daughters are there behind you. 2 out of 3? Thank you very much for being here today. We'll try to embarrass you as much as possible, daughters. And finally, we're delighted to welcome back Dr. Tamara Kaufman-Whitty. It doesn't matter how many times you come here. I'm still going to slaughter your name. Wittes, here we go. Senior Fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute. Previously, Dr. Wittes served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, as well as Middle East Specialist at the U.S. Institute of Peace and Director of Programs at the Middle East Institute. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. We look forward to your testimony. As I said, your written statement will be made a part of the record, so please feel free to summarize. And we will begin with you, Dr. Doran.
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Deutsch.
Move your microphone just a little bit.
How's that? Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee, of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to speak to you today. I thank you for the opportunity to testify on the implications of the elections in Iraq and Lebanon. In both countries, the results represent a setback for the United States. In Lebanon, they have obviously strengthened the hand of Hezbollah. In Iraq, opinion is divided about the extent to which Muqtada Sadr's rise represents a victory for Iran. Even if the results turn out to be less damaging than the pessimists predict, there is nevertheless little doubt that they complicate American efforts to contain Iran. These setbacks, however, are but the latest in a long string of Iranian advances, and they are by no means the greatest advances. With your permission, I will concentrate on how the United States might, in broad strategic terms, rebound and reverse the trend. I will focus my remarks in particular on the strategic implications of President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That decision certainly lays the groundwork for a more effective American policy. It will not, however, prove sufficient to turn the tables on Tehran. The United States, I will argue, should adopt a two-speed approach to its competition with Iran. I will argue it should adopt a two-speed approach to its competition with Iran, aggressive and uncompromising in some areas such as Syria and Lebanon, where it enjoys a freer hand, and more nuanced in countries such as Lebanon and Iraq, where conditions are not conducive to an unfettered competition. Yesterday, Secretary Pompeo laid out a broad strategy or a broad policy of rolling back Iranian power throughout the region, not just in the nuclear program, but also in terms of its support for terrorism and its influence in the region. I strongly welcome this approach. I think it correctly defined the Iranian problem, and I think it dispensed with a lot of the illusions of the last 4 to 5 years, in which we have seen ourselves engaging with moderates in Iran and strengthening them and bringing them into the family of nations. And I think that Secretary Pompeo's speech spoke with admirable clarity about the essence of our strategy now, which is one of coercing Iran. Now, the critics of this policy are presenting it as a choice of war over peace, but I think that's a false depiction, because what they are calling peace was actually appeasement. As I think everyone who spoke today on the subcommittee said, Iran has been on the march, and unfortunately, that march has been facilitated by the enrichment of Iran that the JCPOA made possible. So the administration is to be credited with seeing things clearly and with laying the groundwork for a policy of seriously containing Iran. However, we have to be clear about the fact that Iran is not going to be coerced simply by reimposing the sanctions, which the JCPOA, which the decision about the JCPOA will entail. Coercion means actual coercive policies, the use of hard power to make Iran pay a price for its military adventurism around the region. In Secretary Pompeo's remarks, he actually spoke about crushing Hezbollah and proxies. The word was very evocative. It stood out, but I'm afraid that it didn't strike fear in the hearts of any Iranian leaders, because they have been treated to this kind of frightful rhetoric before, and they have developed a number of clever mechanisms for defeating American hardliners, or let's just say hardline policies. They have come with ways of waiting us out and wearing us down. The two-speed strategy that I suggest is one in which we can actually bring hard power to bear against Iran in some arenas, and in other arenas like Lebanon and Iraq, having a somewhat lighter touch. The essence of it, as I describe in my written testimony, is that we should be relying, especially in Syria and in Yemen, on allies who are already in the hard power fight against Iran, and Israel in particular. I note that our military is very reluctant to get directly involved in the conflict against Iran, and it complains that it doesn't have an authorization of force. Given that fact, given the difficult politics around it, I think where we should be focusing our attention in terms of raising the cost to the Iranians across the board is by strengthening the Israelis in Syria and strengthening the Saudis in Yemen through military support, intelligence support, diplomatic support, and other forms of assistance. In Iraq and Lebanon in particular, I think we have to be aware, we have to admit that our influence has been somewhat diminished, and that the complex nature of our interests in those countries will make it difficult for us to carry out a hard power competition with the Iranians there. But we have to do much more. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, you mentioned the withdrawing support or reviewing support to the LAF. The LAF, in my view, is actually should be of secondary concern to us. The primary concern to me is the control or the influence that Iran and Hezbollah have in the banking and finance sector in Lebanon, and that's where I would put the emphasis. I'll just end by saying that the Bipartisan Policy Center issued a report on Iran policy recently, which laid out 3 basic options without choosing one of them. Option 1 was rollback, option 2 was containment, and option 3 was modus vivendi. Under the Obama administration, we had a policy that sought modus vivendi with Iran without acknowledging it. The effect was that we realigned our policy from Baghdad to Beirut in parallel with the Iranians. When the Trump administration came in, it didn't have a rollback option in any of the in Iraq, in Syria, or in Lebanon. I don't think that this decision that it has made is going to make rollback possible. I think, however, containment in Lebanon and Iraq is possible. Rollback is possible in Syria. But the administration has yet to announce that it is actually going to engage in that kind of hard power rollback, which I think is absolutely essential to the success. If we don't raise the price to Iran across the board, then the strategy that they have outlined will not succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Pletka?
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Mr. Deutsch, members of the committee, thank you so much for asking me to join you here today. It's really a pleasure to be back, and thank you for embarrassing my children. It's really been my life's work, and I'm always happy to have help. A few months ago, I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal asking whether the United States intended to lose Iraq as we have lost Lebanon. The question really feels all the more apropos today in the wake of the troubling elections we've been talking about here today in both those countries. So let's skip to the punchline. In both these cases, the United States has or once had a chance to challenge Iran at a relatively low cost. But as we have already done in Lebanon and Iraq too, I fear, we will miss that chance because we're focused elsewhere, myopic about our potential influence, and really too willing to lie to ourselves about the status quo. We are really apparently indifferent in too many cases to the march of the Islamic Republic of Iran across the greater Middle East. Beginning with Lebanon, the results of the election are as depressing as they were predictable. Prime Minister Saad Hariri's party lost and their allies lost about 15 seats, which was a rout rooted in both Lebanon's own dysfunction, Hariri's own lackluster performance, and the somewhat bizarre interlude during which he was kidnapped to Saudi Arabia. The winners, were two: a protest vote for the Lebanese forces, which shouldn't be confused with the Lebanese armed forces. They picked up 7 seats. And the other was Hezbollah, with its own party and allies picking up about 15 seats. Tammy noted to me that Walid Jumblat's party also picked up seats. Where Walid will stand is always a question in everybody's mind, but he has stood with Hezbollah. This is the same Hezbollah that's amassed an arsenal that would be the envy of many countries. Israel estimates Hezbollah has more than 150,000 rockets in the south of Lebanon, built up in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Worse still, I understand that Iran is changing its arms transfer modus operandi because it recognizes the difficulty of transferring weapons to its proxies over land, through air, over sea. It is instead concentrating on transferring know-how, rocket, missile building, guidance system, things like that. If Hezbollah or the Houthis or Hamas or any of Iran's many proxies throughout the region have the know-how to build more and more advanced weaponry and the operational latitude to do so, as they do now on Lebanese soil, what does the future hold? The last elections confirmed for us that the next government of Lebanon will be run largely by Hezbollah, which means, of course, it will be run largely by Tehran. I know, as Mike said, that the Treasury Department is concerned about the integrity of Lebanon's banking system. In addition, we should be worried about the fact that Hezbollah reportedly wants the Interior Ministry, the Public Works Ministry, and the Economy Ministry for itself, using the cash that they can get out of those ministries to ease the burden on their sponsor in Iran, which is having some economic difficulties. So that leaves for us the Lebanese armed forces. The Lebanese military claims not to coordinate with Hezbollah, but there's evidence to the contrary. Last year, a Hezbollah military parade in Syria included a U.S. M113 armored personnel carrier. Did it come from the Lebanese armed forces? Intelligence sources in some countries say yes. The U.S. says it doesn't think so. But we know that in southern Lebanon, the LAF have allowed Hezbollah to restock, shared intelligence with them, and have jointly manned checkpoints. Given the weight of the evidence, and there's more, I'm pretty sure, in a classified setting, is it not appropriate to worry the government of Lebanon is effectively itself becoming a proxy of Iran? In light of that, consider we've given more than $1.5 billion to Lebanon in security assistance and even more in development and economic support. Defenders of the U.S. posture in Lebanon, including some in the White House, the State Department, and at the Pentagon, suggest the LAF are an effective fighting force against ISIS. General Votel, the commander of CENTCOM, has been very insistent on that regard. But if fighting ISIS is our sole standard, why should we not arm and support Hezbollah? They're pretty good at that too. That's the challenge we face. The enemy of our enemy isn't always our friend, and the same is true, unfortunately, in Iraq. In part assisted by an alliance with the Iraqi military and the so-called Popular Mobilization Forces, we were able to secure a victory against ISIS in Iraq. But this pact with Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard forces boarded Iraqi units will mean the U.S. and the government of Iraq ultimately pay a very heavy price. And look no further than the results of these elections, in which our ally, Haidar al-Abadi, came in third place, trailing the leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces, Hadi al-Amiri, and Muqtada al-Sadr. Unlike in Lebanon, we don't know what the outcome of the Iraqi election is going to be, and it may not be a slam dunk for Iran. But there's an underlying point here, and that is the lesson unlearned by the United States in Lebanon and apparently still unlearned in Iraq today. The Islamic Republic of Iran has a foreign policy model. They do not seek to dominate, they seek to influence, and if necessary, destabilize. They do so through their proxies, and increasingly, through their proxies in Iraq as well. These are Iranian expeditionary forces, nominally loyal to their own countries, but answering to command in Tehran. If I may have just another 30 seconds.
Without objection, go ahead.
Iran is no Soviet Union. Its economy is weak, and its hold over its own people is tenuous, as you yourselves have noted. But victory after victory in the Middle East should suggest to us that Iran has a winning formula. One that could be countered with a serious U.S. strategy of engagement, a theory of our own victory, and one that would not contemplate an every decade return for war in the Middle East. We must shore up the Iraqi government as we failed to shore up the Lebanese against Iran. We must do so without wavering in our commitments and by offering them choices, us or them. Us must mean genuine political and economic engagement and leadership. This is what you were talking about, that both the Obama administration and unfortunately the Trump administration has cut back on. That kind of engagement is far cheaper than war. It must start with aiding the battle against corruption, which erodes confidence in democracy and markets in Beirut and Baghdad. And it must continue with a commitment to institutions of government. You may well ask, because I know we're going to talk about this, whether that is not what we've done with the Lebanese armed forces in Lebanon, and my answer is no. We've looked away as that country's been sucked into the Iranian vortex and failed to bolster those who naturally despise Iran and its terrorist proxies. We've allowed weak leaders to take our money and our weapons while serving a foreign master, perhaps not always directly, but certainly indirectly. We've never put it to our nominal allies that they must stand against Iran and Hezbollah, not simply rhetorically, but actually. We've never laid the burden on them to prove they're not working with a designated terrorist organization. I believe we failed in Lebanon, and I believe we've lost. Now we're faced with the same choice in Iraq. We can either force these countries to choose between Washington and Tehran, or we can continue to bury our heads in the sand and allow Iran to win again and again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Doctor.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the committee, good afternoon and thank you for inviting me. I must begin, as always, by noting that I represent only myself before you today. Brookings does not take institutional positions on policy issues, and although, as Congressman Deutsch noted, I was a leader of the NDI observer delegation in Lebanon, I'm not representing NDI today either. The elections in Iraq and Lebanon earlier this month, I think, present a fragile but important counterpoint to a region in turmoil. Extremists claim that only violence can bring change, and these elections promise another path. And when Lebanon and Iraq pull off free elections under such trying circumstances as these, I think it's harder for strongmen elsewhere to argue that they can't afford the risk to stability of allowing their own peoples a choice in who governs them. The political outcomes from these votes offer both risks and opportunities for American policy. I think we need to be wary of drawing strong conclusions from ambiguous results, and I don't think we have yet lost in either place. There are some developments worth nurturing. To curtail Iranian influence to advance our own interest in stability and counterterrorism, the U.S. needs to stay engaged, using diplomatic and economic tools and working together with regional partners who share our goals of promoting stability and tempering Iranian influence. The greatest risk for American policy toward Lebanon and Iraq right now would be to embark on blunt force policies, either by walking away from the fight or by squeezing these fragile countries into unwelcome crisis. I think those tactics would actually give away American influence and advantage Iran further across the region. Let me describe a couple of trends that I saw in both countries that I think are worth noting and building on. In both Iraq and Lebanon, elections yielded low turnout, 49% in Lebanon, 44% in Iraq. Both those who voted and those who stayed home expressed impatience with established political movements who are more interested in dividing the spoils of government than in actually governing. And in both places, security gains have increased citizens' appetite for effective governance, for governance that meets their core needs. In both countries, the military and the security services are relatively trusted national institutions, certainly compared to other parts of the government. And in both countries, we see in public opinion polls, nationalism is growing relative to sectarianism. And these are trends that present some opportunities for new moderating political forces to emerge. But they also present the risk that if citizen needs aren't addressed, those citizens might just give up on politics and on government as a source of solutions to their problems. So we have a stake in supporting healthy political competition. Now, in neither country did I see an electoral outcome that significantly shifts the balance of power between Iran's allies and its adversaries. As I said, that battle is not over. In Iraq, the process of government formation will be much more important, I think, to determining Iran's role than the election itself was. And I think that the U.S. can be clear about the principles it expects a new government to embrace, and we can work with regional partners to create incentives for Iraqi party leaders to move in the right direction. In Lebanon, I don't think it's quite right to say Hezbollah won these elections. I think, in fact, Hezbollah won the political game a couple of years ago, in October 2016, when a few months after Saudi Arabia cut off its aid to the Lebanese government and to Hariri's political movement, Hariri cut a deal with Hezbollah to return as prime minister. And that's the deal that seems to hold now. But I have to note that Hezbollah's heavy engagement in Syria has costed over 1,000 battle dead. It's weakened its focus on providing for Shia communities in Lebanon. And this political campaign showed that even Hezbollah had trouble getting its loyal voters to the polls, and it faced new independent political challenges it hadn't seen before. I think the failure of Saudi Arabia's my way or the highway approach to Lebanon over the last couple of years should be instructive to us now. Walking away from the table is a good way to ensure you lose the game. And just to slightly correct the view that Danny ascribed to me, it was actually Jaja's Lebanese forces that increased its vote that I was pointing out to you. Jumblat is about the same. One final note, if I may, about our approach to Iran and how these elections fit into the picture. Secretary Pompeo's speech yesterday laid out a list of desiderata for changed Iranian policies that I think we can all agree are worthy goals. But a strategy links goals to means, and yesterday's speech did not lay out a realistic path by which we can achieve the goals that we seek. The Trump administration's declaration of maximum pressure on Iran, I think, is likely to be tested very quickly by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps ratcheting up conflict in existing areas of tension around the region. And while sanctions are important, they have not historically done much to constrain the IRGC's regional activities. Sadly, those activities are relatively cheap for the IRGC and the Iranian regime. What troubles me is that at the same moment, the Trump administration is looking to walk away from key arenas in Syria, abandoning local allies, and freeing up space for both Iranian proxies and Sunni extremists who feed off of one another. It's hard for me to understand the recent White House decisions to withdraw our special forces fighting ISIS, to freeze $200 million in pledged reconstruction assistance, or to cut aid to areas in Idlib province that have been freed from ISIS rule. So I worry that the determination to neglect our hard-won gains in Syria risks the resurgence of ISIS, cuts directly against our ability to shape this ongoing competition for influence against Iran, and weakens our ability to support our anxious regional partners in protecting their own security against Iranian depredation. We've got to stay engaged. We need a strategy that's long-term and one that combines military and intelligence assets with diplomacy and economic support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duran, Ms. Pletka, and Dr. Wittes. Got them all now. I'd like to get your opinion on U.S. policy on our aid to Iraq. If the Badr organization or any Iranian-linked entity continues to control Iraq's interior ministry, is it in the interest of the United States to continue aiding Iraq's interior security force?
I think it is. I think in the short term, we don't know who Sadr is, and it's really a competition now between us and Iran over the direction of Sadr. I would think it'd be too early to make any kind of precipitous change to the policy until we can stand Sadr before a couple of tests and see which way things are going. You know, when you look at the core experiences of the Iranian regime, it all goes back to the Iran-Iraq War. And the threats that emanated from Iraq. So the key desire of the Iranians, I think, the key strategic desire is to make sure that there isn't an independent Iraqi military that can ever threaten Iran again. And that's got to be the key area of competition. My fear is the same as Tammy's, that if we leave the game, we're just going to hand it over to them. The fact of the matter is we have to play the game a little bit more like they do, which is when Iraqis do something that the Iranians don't like, the Iranians threaten their lives or the lives of their loved ones. When Iraqis do something that we don't like, we send a demarche.
Well, let's not adopt their strategy, though.
We have to threaten things that the Iranians hold dear. How's that?
All right, that's better. Thank you, Ms. Pletka.
I'm going to make a slightly less bloodthirsty comment than Mike. I mean, Muqtada Sadr has tried to refashion himself as an anti-corruption crusader. I'm not quite sure it's true, but on the other hand, it's certainly a role that's much needed to be filled in Iraq, as I think we could probably all agree. You know, one of the things that was very interesting that happened in Lebanon some years back, 2 decades back, was that Lebanon had been riven into very, in the wake of the Civil War, it had been riven into all of these different militias who answered to different sects and to different religious parties and to different political parties and to different outside powers. It's not an unanalogous situation to the one that we see in Iraq today, although Iran is the dominant player for sure. And the one thing that I believe we could do to some good effect is to try to help the Iraqi military become a military that serves the government and the people of Iraq and not serves the people and its masters in the IRGC. That's something that they're only going to be able to do with our support. So I think that that engagement is vital. I think that the right way to think about this is competition. We actually do need to compete with Iran on the territory that they designate as important to them in order to ensure that people stand with us, an infinitely preferable ally, than with the Iranians.
Just briefly, I think Danny's correct to say that that Lebanese model of a government that is essentially a patronage mechanism for the parties within it, that is the model that Iraqi governments have followed for the last several cycles. It's possible they don't need to follow that model this time. And I think that there is actually increased pressure from voters to see a more effective government. And that's why Sadr kind of rebranded himself in this campaign. So I think that that gives us something we can build on if we can create the incentives. The other thing I would say is that I think all of these Iraqi parties know that this government is not going to yield enough patronage for them if security is not maintained. They all know that they need effective internal security, and they know that they need American help to do it. I think that that does give us quite a bit of leverage if we maintain those relationships.
Thank you very much. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was struck, Ms. Pletka, by the way you described Iran's interests seeking not to destabilize, seeking not to dominate, but to destabilize and influence, and which then made me think that that seems to be the same approach that that some other countries take. It's the Russian approach. And I read through the Secretary's speech again just now, and I'd like to just couch this discussion, take a step out and view it through Iran's activities in Syria. Iran on the ground in Syria attempting, and very clearly, I mean, in Syria perhaps it might be different, much closer to domination than destabilization, but the Russians very clearly interested in destabilization in Syria, a policy that extends throughout the region, I would think. And I'd like you just to speak to that combination and the fact, as Dr. Wittes says, that a strategy needs to show us how that we're going to satisfy our goals and what means we're going to use to satisfy those goals. And if we're talking about the outcome of the elections, but we're not talking about what's happening in Syria and the role that Russia plays, then is it even worth having a conversation about Iran at all if we ignore that critical relationship?
I couldn't agree with you more. Let me be honest. I don't think that any strategy that looks at Iran can be through a soda straw in which we said this, to my mind, was what was wrong with the JCPOA. The JCPOA was something that compartmentalized certain things in Iran and left others in their baskets to be dealt with later. But of course, they weren't dealt with later. Now, you know, we can talk about whether that was a good choice or the right way done, but that is in some ways water under the bridge. But if we are about to begin depart on a new strategy towards the Iranians that is going to crush them and their regime and their economy, isn't the right place to start where in Syria? This has been inexplicable to me for since 2011, frankly. There are those who suggest that there's an opportunity for us in Yemen. I think that's a slightly more complex environment. The Saudis and the Emiratis are there. But as long as the Iranians are victorious in Syria, whether it's for themselves or for their allies in the Assad regime, we are not going to be rolling them back. And your note about the Russians is exactly correct. The Russians are opportunists. The Russians are there because we are not. The Russians have stepped in not because the costs are high to them, but because the opportunities are disproportionate to the costs. And we have not done enough to raise the costs to the Russians for their adventures overseas. So
Dr. Wittes, what's the right approach then, particularly vis-a-vis Russia? How is it? What in the strategy that you're looking for, in the strategy that all of us are waiting for, what should that strategy? How does that strategy include Russia? How do we, and then how does that affect the way we deal with Iran in Lebanon and in Iraq?
You know, I think for a number of years the Russians have played this double game with the U.S. and the West in Syria, where they have simultaneously taken advantage of all the opportunities that Danny just laid out. But in addition to that, said, well, when push comes to shove, we can help deliver the Iranians on a solution here. We can constrain them. And the question I've always had is, even were they willing, which they have yet to really demonstrate they are willing to do, could they, in fact, deliver Iran? And this week, I think, is instructive in that regard, where you had a clear statement out of Moscow about the need for foreign forces to depart Syria. And the Iranians turned around immediately and said, well, I don't know who you're talking about. We're not going anywhere. So, you know, it may be that American strategy needs to push the Russians to make a choice and then see that the Iranians are not actually going to go along with their preferences, and therefore that Russia needs to work with us to contain Iran's role here.
Right, I just want to make sure I understand it. America's role, America should push Russia to make what choice?
Rather than simultaneously saying to us, we'll deliver the Iranians, and saying to the Iranians, we'll get the West off your back, that they need to make that they need to repeat what they did this week. They need to make set some clear expectations and some clear constraints on the Iranians. Now, they have incentive to do that right now because of this prospect of escalation between Israel and Iran, because Israel has made so clear that it will not tolerate IRGC embedding themselves near the Israeli border. And this is threatening Russia's own gains in Syria. Why is it there? It's there because it wants a permanent military presence. It wants to play spoiler against us, and it wants to make money in Syria's reconstruction. And if there ends up being a hot Iranian-Israeli war over Syrian territory, Russia's not going to make any money. So I think this is actually a moment where we can push them to push the Iranians, and they will see they cannot deliver Iran, and they're going to have to take a harder stance.
And doesn't that have to be? Does that have to be a public pronouncement? And if it needs to be a public pronouncement, wouldn't that be the kind of pronouncement, the kind of pressure to make a decision that would belong in, say, a big speech about Iran policy also?
Yes, to me, one of the biggest missing pieces of the speech from Secretary Pompeo this week was that coalition. He kept talking about an international coalition that agrees with our goals, that's going to work with us to advance our goals, and yet he could not specify any track of American policy or activity beyond we're going to go out to capitals and talk to them. that would actually produce that result.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Duran, I appreciate your book, Ike's Gamble, on what the U.S. can learn from Eisenhower's administration as we examine how to treat our friends and partners in the region. I'm curious what you think about Iraq's election results, and I'm even more curious to hear your thoughts on the impact.
For me, the main takeaway from the Iraq election is that Iraq cannot be the primary arena in which we're pushing back against the Iranians, but it is absolutely vital that we engage in very significant competition with the Iranians in Iraq, but more so that there are arenas in which we have aggressive, unfettered competition with the Iranians. If we don't show all of our allies in the region that we are really serious about rolling back Iranian power, not just causing them some pain, but rolling them back, I'm afraid we'll lose the competition. There was actually in my book, since you mentioned it, one of my favorite moments in Eisenhower's experience with the Middle East came in 1958 after the Iraqi Revolution, which took Iraq away from the West. And Eisenhower decided to intervene in Lebanon. And he met with Sam Rayburn, and Sam Rayburn said, Mr. President, I'm worried about two things. Number one, I'm worried about the Russians, that this will provoke them. And number two, I'm worried that we are going to alienate Arab public opinion, both of which are important. And I'm afraid, actually three things. I'm also afraid that there's no end game, basically, and that this will all end badly. And Eisenhower said, and I think it was a great moment of tremendous honesty, he said, oh, it's going to end badly. I can assure you of that. The only question is, does it end badly with us reassuring our allies that we are with them against their enemy, or does it end badly with us not supporting our allies?
Thank you.
That's the situation that we're in now. We have to demonstrate to the region that we really mean business. Reimposing the sanctions is good, but we have to really push back against the Iranians where they are pushing hard, which is Syria.
I agree. Dr. Wittes, you just returned from observing Lebanon's elections. I'm sure we both agree that Lebanon's successful elections are a promising sign for Middle East democracy, but the real source of democratic longevity is bottom-up support, and that takes a long time to develop. Are Lebanon's young people engaged in the democratic process, and to what extent has Iran and Hezbollah stunted democratic growth in Lebanon?
Thank you, Congresswoman Wagner. That's a fantastic question. I would say that over the years, I have been visiting Lebanon, and I also observed the 2009 elections. There's been quite a flowering of civic engagement and activism among Lebanese youth. The main domestic observer organization, LADE, is basically a youth-run organization. The Lebanese Transparency Association also represents that rising generation of Lebanese. And there were about 800,000 new voters. The age of voting is 21 in Lebanon, and because it had been 9 years since the last election, 800,000 new voters had entered the rolls. So all of the parties had to respond to the frustration that young people were expressing that these tired sectarian patronage systems were not meeting their needs. And I think that does offer the opportunity for a shift away from sectarian politics to something that's more focused on government effectiveness. Now, the U.S. government has made long-term investments in Lebanese civil society, in youth engagement and empowerment, in civic education, and sadly, those investments have flagged in the last year. And I really do believe those are important and worthwhile to sustain.
Great. Well, thank you for that answer. And I'm about out of time. Ms. Pleka, I have a question to you, but I will spare your daughters. And Madam Chairman, I will submit it for the record, and I thank our witnesses very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and again, thank you to the witnesses for sharing your perspectives today. Dr. Wittes, I'll start with you. You made the statement that strategy should be linked to links goals to means, and that in this region, the United States appears to lack a strategy. I'll start with you, but I'll open to the whole panel. What are the implications of not having a strategy and the consequences that if we don't get one shortly, we're going to face?
Well, thank you. I think the primary consequence, in addition to simply being ineffective in achieving our goals, is in our relationships with those in the region who rely on their partnerships with us and on our support. And over the course of the last 5 months, I've been to Saudi Arabia twice, I've been to Kuwait, I've been to Lebanon, I'll be in Israel next month. And I would say that I hear across the board anxiety about American policy and American leadership. The intentions are there, the rhetoric sounds great. None of them loved the Iran deal, although the Gulf accepted it, and I think all of them had some anxieties about letting it go. But what they really want to know is, are you there for us for the long haul? Can we count on you when it matters? And there, I think, there are real anxieties emerging. And I would say that the recent Trump administration decisions on Syria have piqued that anxiety even farther.
Ms. Pleka?
The consequences of not having a strategy are as we've all described, which is that our allies in the region are full of doubt that people who are fundamentally well-intentioned at any particular level, whether in governance or in economics or in civil society, are worried that there's not going to be a power that stands by them, and that those who are there are going to take advantage of our absence in order to push the region back toward the direction of autocracy, or worse, in the case of Iraq, and I would say in Lebanon as well. But there's another problem here, and that's a problem of continuity from the Obama administration. Barack Obama famously told the Saudis that they were going to need to learn to share the region with the Iranians, as if somehow the two of them should split everything up while we go home. That's not a policy, and it's not a strategy, and it was a mistake then, and unfortunately subcontracting to our allies in the region to do what they think is right in the absence of a strategy is not a great idea either. The bottom line is, and I hope all of us actually agree on this, no matter where we stand on the political spectrum, the bottom line is that there is no substitute for U.S. leadership. Our values, the things we stand for, and that does not mean, as I think our previous president too often insisted, a choice between abandoning the region and war. It really means engagement. It means standing up for the kinds of things that matter to the future of the region in the long term, so we don't have to go back. Good governance, markets, right. Those are the things that matter, and we need a strategy to get to those things.
I agree with you, and if I take a step down, Dr. Moran or Duran, that might be the segue to you. I think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what I heard you say is that we should allow Israel to push back against Iran in Syria. And I'll raise the question, absent a strategy, is Israel confronting Iran on the border between Israel and Syria has one dynamic, and the United States working with our allies in the region to keep Iran out of Syria has another dynamic. I think the former carries a lot more risk and negative consequence than the latter. I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, in an ideal world, I would prefer that the United States define the end state that it wants in Syria and put together the coalition to achieve it, assigned roles and missions and so on. But after watching our politics over the last 5 years, I doubt that's going to happen. And I see on both sides of the political aisle not a lot of appetite for nation building in Syria. So I work from the assumption that that's the baseline, and I have to work within that parameter. And that's why I am talking about supporting the Israelis. I mean, I was struck a couple months ago then Secretary of State Tillerson made a statement, a prepared statement about our Iran policy, in which he said that the United States was working to counter Iran across the region. And then General Votel, the commander of U.S. CENTCOM, was testifying before Congress and was asked what the military is doing to counter Iran and Syria. And he said, it's not a U.S. military mission to counter Iran and Syria.
I think what he said was he hasn't been given instructions.
But it's also clear to me that the military doesn't really want to do it. So,
I'm out of time.
The basic point is, if we're not going to do it directly, then the next best thing is to support our allies who will. And yesterday, Secretary Pompeo said we want Syria devoid of Iranians. So do the Israelis. So let's associate ourselves directly with Israeli red lines and support them.
Well, I agree with that. I agree that we need to support Israel. It's our most important ally in the region, one of our most important allies in the world. But I would just argue that it would be better if Israel doesn't have to confront an Iran with permanent bases in Syria, and instead we work with Israel and our other allies to make sure that Iran can't establish that permanent presence in Syria.
I totally agree with you.
I yield back.
Thank you so much. Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
You know, when we discuss the Middle East, it seems so mind-boggling in its various parts, and I think that we have gotten so far away from trying to deal with reality in order to keep in place lines that were drawn by colonialists 100 years ago. I mean, here we have basically we're on the verge of war. Not on the verge of war. We are engaged, dramatically engaged, with violent and warlike activities, all based on alliances on these lines that were drawn. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Iraq was not a country until the colonialists made it a country. And here we're talking about how we're going to keep faith with Iraq. There is no Iraq. The fact is that there are different nationality groups in Iraq that go many centuries. Just to be very bold, I think that perhaps if we're ever going to have peace in that region or be a force for peace in the region, it's not going to be because we're taking sides and we're involved with the unrelenting confusion and chaos that we've seen going on there. We don't need to say that we support the Iraqis, but what we do need is to find those nationalities that are at play. The Kurds are a nationality. They are people who recognize themselves as Kurds. The Iraqis don't see themselves that way. Am I wrong? They see themselves as Kurds. They have various different groups within Iraq, and that's how they see themselves. In Lebanon, we know that you had the Druze, you've had the Muslims, and you had Christians. I don't know. I guess it's been a good thing to try to keep Lebanon together. But I remember when I was in the White House when Ronald Reagan sent the Marines into Beirut. And I remember that my brother's best friend, who joined the Marine Corps right after they graduated from Camp Lejeune High School, was blown to bits in that little incident. And Ronald Reagan knew immediately that was not the right tactic to use. And that's when he worked with, and I'm going to brag here, he worked with myself and a number of people, maybe 5 or 6 others, who established an alternative strategy to sending American troops everywhere. And that was called the Reagan Doctrine. And it seems to me it worked because it brought down our primary enemy, which was the Soviet Union. I guess my question to you folks is that, number one, there is a Persian entity, a nationality. You have Iran, but again, we're trying to deal transactionally with a nation state that doesn't exist. You've got Baluch, you've got Kurds, you do have a Persian heart of Iran. Should we not be going into the reality of trying to do, instead of trying to deal transactionally with what are actually non-nations, because with the colonial leftover designations of territory under what jurisdiction, wouldn't it be better for us to try to restructure and work with those people in restructuring borders by siding with those nationalities, like Persians, as compared to the Iranian mullah regime, like the Kurds, like the various Christian, there's Christian elements there in Syria as well, and we know where I guess we're trying to work with them. I don't know if that makes any sense to you or not, but what doesn't make sense to me is what we're doing when hearing over and again how we're siding with that group. We're going to hope that this group wins the election, and there's no really substance historically to any of the groups that we're talking about. So, as I say, as compared to selecting the Persians, selecting the Baluch, selecting the Kurds, selecting those groups, the Druze, who are people who have a real nationality about them. And sorry for gone on too long in this question, but if you want to have a comment to show me how naive I am to thinking that we can deal with a Kurdish nation instead of Iraq.
You did take up the entire 5 minutes with the question, but we'll have, who's the designated answer? Dr.
Okay,
Duran?
I won't take more than 10 minutes.
Okay.
Pardon me, I'm sorry for it. I mean, going on.
No, I don't actually agree with you in this sense that yes, those states were created by the colonialists, but they've been there for a century, and that's what we've got. And any attempt to redraw the borders is going to be highly controversial, and it's going to affect the lives of millions, and it's going to be an act of imperialism at least as great as the act that created those states to begin with. And it's only going to hold if the United States military is there in force to hold it. And so, I mean, you're talking about another George W. Bush-style invasion of the region in order to redraw the boundaries. So I think we're stuck with what we've got, which is working with those states which are recognized, but also recognizing, as you say, that there are sub-state actors who have their own independent organization and ability to influence things. So it's it's an art of balancing the two. But redrawing the boundaries, I don't think will get us out of the fire.
Well, at least we should be dealing with people who we can make who could be our friends in order to defeat the primary enemy, which is what happened when we defeated the Soviet Union.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'd like to first turn to Iraq and ask you, Dr. Wittes, is it possible for the U.S. to work with al-Sadr and his allies if they do form a government in terms of achieving our short and long-term objectives in Iraq? Kind of what are your assessments of his true motivations and where do his loyalties lie? And assuming his coalition does take control of the government, can the U.S. be expected to work in concert with the same coalition who murdered American troops and our Iraqi partners in droves during the height of the Iraq War? Do we have any mutual interest that would make that a possibility, and what's your assessment?
Well, Congressman, I think it's a crucial question. I don't think there's an obvious answer. But I would say that, yes, I think we do have some interests in common. We'll have to see how Muqtada al-Sadr chooses to play his cards. He has demonstrated a great deal of political agility, let me put it that way, over the years. He's quite an opportunist, and he now sees the political opportunity in moving away from militancy, moving away from Iran, declaring independence, moving against the corruption visible in other parties, including some of the traditional Shia parties that are more closely allied with the popular mobilization units, the militias, and more closely allied with Tehran. So let's see what we can do. Let's see, first of all, what his intentions are in terms of government alliances, and then let's see how we can work with that. I think our interests are, number one, maintaining security and counterterrorism cooperation with the Iraqi government. Number two, an Iraqi government that is committed to neutrality in regional conflicts. To give you a very specific example, we do not want an Iraqi government that would be willing to tolerate these Iraqi militias helping transfer militias into Syria, for example. That simply is something we can't afford to see again. We want an Iraqi government that will work to resolve the conflict with Kurdistan, and we want an Iraqi government that will advance reform, especially in the economy. At least what we hear from al-Sadr right now, I think is encouraging on all of those fronts, and I think we need to press for clarity.
Thank you. And what is your opinion with respect to Iranian goals in Iraq, and what are they doing to achieve those objectives?
So I think their goals are a few. Fundamentally, I agree with Danny that they are more interested in having a veto than in having overwhelming control. But I think that the situation in Syria is such that they now seek to use Iraq as well as a sort of staging ground. And that's something that we must prevent. I think there's also money, frankly, to be made there, both for them and for their allies. And I think that we need to ensure that that doesn't destabilize the country. And so, you know, the goal from an American perspective of an Iraqi government that is neutral in regional conflicts itself is a goal that heads off Iranian interests. It's a goal that will require Iraqi Shia parties in a coalition government to push back against Iranian requests on a number of important fronts, and I think that's worth investing in. And
finally, the Iranian representative, obviously vying for Iranian interests in Baghdad, is General Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force. Considering al-Sadr's anti-Iran stance, do you think General Soleimani can successfully vie for a pro-Iran government? And if not, if they're not successful in securing a pro-Iranian government in Baghdad, what will the ramifications be for Iran's land bridge, and what are the implications of that?
Okay, so here we get into a little bit of speculation in Iraqi politics, which is very, very unpredictable. I think there are two major possibilities for government formation. One would be a Sadr alliance with a body that might exclude all, if not most, of those more pro-Iranian political factions. It's possible they could also put together a big unity government, but I think Sadr's initial inclination is an alliance with a body that would keep some of those guys out. I think what Soleimani would probably like to do is put together a grand coalition of pro-Iranian Shia parties, bring in some other non-Shia parties who want to feed at the government trough, and keep Sadr out. And so to me, I think there's a bit of a zero sum there. And I think Sadr is going to be looking to see what's on the table, not only for himself and his political allies, but for an Iraqi government in which he would participate. Our Gulf allies, for example, have put on the table significant potential economic investments. The Saudis have done, I think, a very creditable job of courting Sadr over the last year, including welcoming him in the kingdom. They've opened a consulate in Basra. They've opened their border to trade with Iraq. The Kuwaitis are also suggesting that they could do a lot more business in southern Iraq. And so there are incentives in play. And I think the American role here is important as well. I think it's important that we not make the mistake of saying, well, our counterterrorism fight against ISIS is over. Let's cut economic engagement. Let's cut diplomatic engagement. Let's go home.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. Thank you to our witnesses, and let's hope for the best, but we fear the worst about the implications of these elections. Thank you so much, and with that, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you. Bye, daughters.